Good evening, everyone. Welcome back to the Old Seward Post Office and the first of our 2021-2022 lecture series and our first hybrid program. We hope you enjoyed the Zoom meetings in the last program year that we were forced to do because of the pandemic. I would like to let everyone know that the protocol to come into the building in public areas is to wear a mask. So once you enter the Historical Society or the conference room or lecture, you're permitted to take your mask off if you like. Please feel free to keep it on and feel more comfortable about it. Tonight we have the opportunity to have Dr. David Schwartz, PhD of the University of Nevada, Las Vegas, speak to us on Atlantic City. Amanda has done a wonderful job bringing together the program schedule this year, thinking we were going to be remote again. We have some wonderful speakers from around the country who will be doing this, and we'll be presenting these hybrid programs along with the in-person annual meeting as we had last year. Dr. Schwartz has served as a faculty member of UNLV since 2001, earning tenure in 2006, and promotion in 2013. In addition to his current role, he's also affiliate of the Department of History. From 2019 to 2021, he served as Associate Vice Provost of Faculty Affairs, where he provided support from the ground, faculty tenure and promotion, shared governance, and related issues. Prior to serving as Associate Provost, Schwartz was the Director of the Center for Gaming Research within University Libraries. In both 2001 and 2018, he was responsible for administering the Center's faculty fellowship program, managing the growth of the gaming collection, serving as publisher of the interdisciplinary Event LV Gaming Press. He also served on various campus committees, including chairing the University Promotion and Tenure Committee. What a great career. Sounds more like fun than work. What a great place to have it. Looking back at Las Vegas, and he's going to look at Atlantic City, a popular resort destination for residents of Swiftly, as you saw in the Signals newsletter. Many people went there for many reasons, from the healthy air to the entertainment. So he's going to tell us all about the history of Atlantic City. Amanda, could you please make a few statements to the audience about programs and moving forward? We hope everybody had a chance to sign in. And have it, please sign in and register. We do need to keep that for the building record.
So welcome, everyone. I am really excited about this talk. Atlantic City, I've gone there on vacation, and it's fun to hear the history of it. So I'm really excited to have Dr. Schwartz here with us tonight, virtually. A couple of things. Like Joe said, if you can sign in, that's a Sweetwater request on our part to just make sure you know everyone that's here in case we need to contact you for COVID reasons or whatever. If you can in the future, RSVP in advance so we know how many chairs to set up, that would be great. Same with the online. That just gives me an idea of who to expect in the chat room. So right now, we're about 14 people, which is about what was signed up. So we're good there. Our next presentation will be on Audley D. Nichols, and I'm really excited about that topic. I hope you guys will come up for that as well. Those speakers are coming to us from Detroit and Grand Rapids, Michigan. It's an author and a collector of Audley D. Nichols' work. And if you're not familiar with who that is, the logo of the Historical Society is a rendering of his from the Swickley Bridge poster in 1911. So that'll be a great program. There's postcards on the table. Grab those on your way out. And just so you know, I'm about to swivel, hopefully, this camera so that David can get a little more view of everyone watching him. The marvel of technology. And I will turn it over to him when he is ready to go.
Thank you, Dr.
Okay, thank you, everybody. Can everybody see my screen?
Yes.
Awesome. So this is just a pretty quick look back at Atlantic City history. And I divided it up into 4 parts. First, the founding of the city, then the early years of the city, the classic years of the hotels and the boardwalk, and then the rebirth in casino gaming. And I'd like to, hopefully you have some good questions at the end, because I find that I thrive with questions. Okay, so the founding of the city. Well, just to give you a little bit of background, if you're not familiar with it, Atlantic City is a very small city, less than 40,000 people live there on Absecon Island, which is a barrier island off the shore of New Jersey, down south. Today, via the Atlantic City Expressway, it's about an hour from Philly, and the New Jersey Turnpike, it's about 2.5 hours from New York. So it's pretty close to those big cities. A good thing about it, because it's an island, it's a little bit of a milder climate than you would find inland. So it's always a little bit cooler in the summer, a little bit warmer in the winter. Here's a Google map of it, and you can see there is the city, Atlantic City, along with the city of Ventnor City, Margate, and Longport on Absecon Island. All right, cool. So the first people to visit that area, to visit the island, to visit what would become Atlantic City, were the Lenni Lenape Indians, who began coming there at some point in the past. It's kind of interesting, just like people would later on. They spent the summers there collecting shells and things like that. The British didn't show up until almost the end of the 17th century. They mapped the island then. They didn't really do a lot. Every now and then a ship would stop there and pick up supplies. But really not too much happened for about 100 years. Then in 1783, right after the end of the Revolutionary War, Lieutenant Jeremiah Leeds, who'd just gotten out of the Continental Army, bought title to some land on the island. And then the island was known as, and the city was known, or wasn't really a city, let's say the region was known as Absecon Beach. And true to the name, it was mostly beach. There were a couple of, I wouldn't call them forests, but stands of trees. And he kept on buying land. By 1838, he owned over 1,000 acres. So he was pretty excited about this place. And his kids and grandchildren stay there on the island. And I'm thinking this would make a really good Netflix show, although kind of boring for the first 100 years. His wife, Millicent, opened a business called Aunt Millie's Boarding House, which was the first business on the island. So there you have it, hospitality from the start. And things were going along so-so until 1850, when a doctor named Jonathan Pitney kind of got an idea. And the idea was, let's make Atlantic City a health resort, or Absecon Beach a health resort. So he started by writing letters to the Philadelphia newspapers and said, hey, Absecon Beach is great, and we should build a railroad between Philadelphia and down here. And he convinced the Iron King of Hamilton, New Jersey, Samuel Richards, to build it. Richards, who was very influential politically, went to the New Jersey State Legislature and got the Camden and Atlantic Railroad chartered in 1852. So this happened pretty quickly. Richards hired a developer named Richard Osborne to build the railroad. Osborne came down and said, look, if you want to really attract visitors, you've got to change the name, change it to Atlantic City. So they did, even though it wasn't really a city. Osborne was also the one who surveyed Atlantic City first and laid out the street grid. And if you've been there, or if you've played Monopoly, you might recall that the streets are named after basically the 7 seas and the Pacific, Atlantic, Arctic, Baltic, Mediterranean, Adriatic, and Caspian. And then the streets going in the east-west direction or north-south direction are named mostly after states. A couple are also named after cities, and a couple are named after people, mostly states. Okay, so Atlantic City is incorporated on March 3rd, 1854. At the time, there were a lot of hotels being built in preparation for the railroad. On May 1st, Chalkley Leeds, the son of Jeremiah Leeds, was elected the first mayor. And I don't think there was as much concern about election fraud back then, because the way they elected him is they had a meeting at the United States Hotel, And the 18 men in attendance just dropped their ballots into a cigar box. And that was it. Nobody was worried about hacking or anything. Finally, July 1st, the first train showed up, and they hadn't finished the bridge across Lakes Bay, which is the body of water that divides Absecon Island from the mainland. So train pulls up to a terminal there. You'd get off, you'd get in a rowboat, go across to another train station, which then took you to the United States Hotel. And here's a picture of the US Hotel. Again, this is pretty early on, and you can see there's a road down to the beach there, a little path down to the beach, and a lot of small, very small houses and stuff. Okay, so that's the US Hotel. It's the early years. There we have a picture. This is circa about 1890 of a family vacationing on the beach. And you see, what I think is interesting about this is you can see there's a amusement pier in the background. You can see a raised boardwalk with no railings and some small buildings, but you don't have those big hotels on the boardwalk. We'll get to that. So some of the reasons why Atlantic City did not immediately become an entertainment and vacation destination was that it was expensive. The cheapest ticket, round trip ticket down there, was about $3. Also, even though Dr. Pitney said this is a very salubrious climate, it actually wasn't that healthy. There were a lot of salt marshes all over the island and ponds and things like that. And as you know, that breeds mosquitoes, and also something that's, I don't know if it's unique to Atlantic City, but I have not seen them out here in the West Coast, greenhead flies, which are like regular house flies, but they bite you. And if anybody's been down on the shore, these things are awful. Greenheads are the worst. Kind of a really interesting story early on. And Atlantic City does have a history of political corruption. Here's a good example. So the city went around hiring people to level the hills, flatten the hills out, and fill the ponds. So they hired one man, we'll call him Mr. A, to level the hills. They hired another man, we'll call him Mr. B, to fill the ponds. And Mr. A, instead of leveling the hills and dragging away the dirt, instead called up Mr. B and said, okay, I know where you can get some fill for your ponds. Took full payment for leveling the hill, and Mr. B did all the work. So that's kind of set the tone for the city. 1858, the flies were so bad that people's cows drowned themselves in the ocean trying to escape from getting bitten. That bad. Civil War, which started 3 years later, interrupted the growth of the city. But after the Civil War, things started to pick up. And by the 1870s, you had 3 railroads competing, so prices really dropped. So everybody could afford to go to Atlantic City. There were 3 major hotels by this time: the US Hotel, Congress Hall, and the Surf House. There were also dozens of smaller hotels, also literally hundreds of cottages and boarding houses. Reed's Drugstore was the first brick building, and it's not there anymore. First brick building was built back in 1878. And by 1880, 5,000 people lived there year round. So it's a pretty big change from when it was just Jeremiah Leeds and his family. And some hotels are even open through the winter, which originally they were open only for the summer. Okay, so here's a picture of Diston College, which was an early, I put in quotes, hotel. But this gives you an idea of what a large hotel at that time would look like. And it really is a glorified boarding house. Okay, the boardwalk is one of the things Atlantic City is famous for. And just pulling that over there. Nice to I can see everybody in this screen. I'll tell you the story about how the boardwalk got started. So originally, the big hotels like the US Hotel were on Atlantic Avenue, which is 2 blocks from the beach. But they still had a problem because the guests would go around walking on the beach in the sand. They would come back and track the sand in and get sand on the furniture, sand on the carpets. So in 1870, Jacob Keim and a man who had the best name for this ever, Alexander Boardman, and I think his name was his destiny, came up with a solution, which was, in their words, a walkway of boards on the sand, which we believe will overcome our sand problems. They were 2 hotel owners. They were sick of it. And the idea was, instead of walking on the actual sand, the visitors to Atlantic City would stroll down the boards. The first boardwalk was 10-foot long boards in 12-foot or 10-foot wide boards in 12-foot sections. And it was only about a foot above the beach. There was no railing, so if you fell off, you fell off. And at the end of the season, they would pack it up and store it. 1880, they built a second one that was 14 feet wide, also summer only. 1884, they built a third one, which was permanent and was raised 5 feet above the beach. Okay, finally, 1890, they built the fourth boardwalk, which this was after a very bad storm and washed away most of the previous one, which was 24 feet wide with railings. And then finally, the fifth time, they built the Fifth Boardwalk in 1896. It was 40 feet wide, permanent, and had railings and stairs and ramps. And pretty much that's the same boardwalk as we have today, although none of the boards are still there, obviously, after over 120 years. It's kind of a Ship of Theseus thing where they replace one section, then another section. And then, is it a new boardwalk now, or is it still the same old one? So kind of interesting. So here's a picture of the boardwalk a little bit later on after the rise of, we see Steel Pier in the background and Steeplechase Pier in the front. But this is what it looked like. You see people very well dressed up, all the men wearing hats. And that's what it would have looked like in the early years of the 20th century. Okay, 1910. So the original vacation season, tourist season, was Memorial Day to Labor Day. In 1882, the business owners decided to hold a musical festival in September to expand the season. In the 1880s, so what would you do in Atlantic City? Well, you would go to a hop, which was a dance. There were also a lot of opera houses all over the city, so lots of live performances. They had sea bathing, horseback riding on the beach. And in 1887, even though they added a lot of hotels, there were so many visitors that people had to sleep in the staircases in the hotels and boarding houses. There were not enough beds. Good problem to have. So a little bit of history. If you've been there, you might have bought a box of saltwater taffy. Where's that come from? Well, a couple of people started selling taffy on the boardwalk in 1880. In 1883, a guy named David Bradley's store got swamped by a storm, by a pretty bad storm. And somebody said, hey, are you open for business? He says, oh, only if you want saltwater taffy, because it was all soaked by salt water. And for some reason, people really liked it. And within about 10 years, it was nationally known. People were writing about it all over the country and eating it all over the country. And here's a picture. You might want this for a nice after dinner treat. Nice little picture of saltwater taffy from James Saltwater Taffy, which is one of the major providers of saltwater taffy in the city to this very day. Okay, so that's saltwater taffy, and I can just taste it. Okay, so more growth. By 1890, there was officially a winter season from January to March. All of Atlantic Avenue, which was the main street, was paved with gravel and seashells. And keep in mind, they didn't have a lot of cars. It was mostly horses back then. All the hotels and the boarding houses were booked up. By 1900, over 30,000 people are living there. So it's rapid growth. There's a huge fire on April 3rd, 1902, which was started supposedly when a black dog, and nobody knows whose dog it was or what its name was, but they do know it was a black dog, kicked over a lamp, started this huge fire, which destroyed 30 buildings and took a lot of the boardwalk with it. And it's interesting because it took them 10 hours to rebuild the boardwalk, and they built back the other buildings a lot bigger and fancier. Now we're going to talk about classic hospitality. We have the Marlborough, Blenheim, and the Dennis, and the Traymore in the far distance there. It's the Golden Jubilee. 1904, Atlantic City celebrated its 50th year, and they had several temporary commemorative structures, including the Founders Column, which was interesting. The Founders Column was especially interesting because there were some political scores being settled. It did not mention the name of Jeremiah Leeds, who actually, bought the land originally, or Chalkley Leeds, or any member of the Leeds family. So they were on the outs by then. And there's not a lot of stuff about the Leeds family in Atlantic City, but it's interesting. If you go offshore, there's a road called Jimmy Leeds Road, one of the descendants of the Leeds family. And they, even though officially March was when it was incorporated, they decided to wait until June when the weather was nicer. They started out with a prayer, they had speeches, they had a big dinner, 3 nights of fireworks. They had a marine parade with boats, a military parade, and a floral parade. Big into parades. And they said, in a couple of years, we're going to have 100,000 people living here. And by the year 2000, we'll be the preeminent destination in the whole world. A couple of things happened. World War I, as we know, broke out in 1914. The United States got involved in 1917. Atlantic City hosted the first wartime gathering of businessmen in 1917, and they talked about what to do. Herbert Hoover, who was then in charge of aid to Belgium, later would become Secretary of Commerce and President, talked about how we had to help Europe and about how business and government had to cooperate to avoid the specter of communism. There was a little bit of naval activity. So the German Navy mined the area around Lewis, Delaware, which is across the Delaware Bay from Cape May, because they wanted to shut down the port of Philadelphia. There were a couple of scares where they thought local fishing boats were going to be targeted and sunk, but they never were. And after the war, there was a monument that was built on Albany Avenue, and it used to be that traffic went around it in a circle. And I distinctly remember learning how to drive and having a lot of anxiety about going around the monument, because that was kind of a scary thing. And if you could do that, you were good to drive pretty much anywhere. Yeah, the monument. And it was right across my high school, from my high school. So a couple of hotels. The U.S. Hotel was the oldest. For a while, it was the biggest in the country. At its peak, it had 600 rooms. The Dennis Hotel started as a cottage in 1860. And basically, it was just a Burlington, New Jersey teacher summer home. And he invited his family to stay, and he kept adding rooms. 7 years later, he sells it, and it becomes a full-on hotel. And for a lot of decades, the Dennis was a dry hotel, meaning they did not serve alcohol there. Eventually, it expanded to 550 rooms. And interestingly enough, this structure is still around today. One of the few, I'd say maybe 3 or 4 hotels that I mentioned that's still there today. The Shelburne next door gets started a couple years later. George M. Cohan supposedly wrote the wartime song Over There, although there is some doubt about that. Diamond Jim Brady was often stayed there and really liked it there. Okay, there's a picture of the Dennis Hotel. So you see pretty substantial brick building. Here's the interior of the Dennis Hotel. So very luxurious in the inside, a far cry from the cottage origins. And you can see no sand in sight. So the boardwalk solved the problem. The Shelburne is another famous one. Okay, there that one is. The Brighton opened as a cottage in 1876. By 1881, it's a all-year full-service hotel. It was famous nationally for being the home of an alcoholic beverage known as the Brighton Punch. And it grew a lot. The Traymore is another famous one, very famous, started out as a rooming house and eventually was the biggest in Atlantic City. That was after the U.S. Hotel had closed. And in 1914, they replaced the wooden buildings with a concrete building that opened in 1915. And this was huge. And it was described as the Taj Mahal of Atlantic City. And for many years, this was the biggest hotel in the city. It was demolished in 1972. Apparently, when they made the concrete, they decided to use salt water, which, as you can imagine, doesn't do great things to steel rebar in the concrete. So it would have been incredibly expensive to somehow preserve it because it was basically crumbling from within. But it had a good run. And today it is a parking, well, it's not even a parking lot, it's a big empty lot. So there's a picture of the Brighton. A couple other, like one other famous one, the Marlborough House opens in 1901. 5 years later, the Blenheim opens next door. The Blenheim portion was famous. Thomas Edison helped to design the concrete that they used. It had the Spanish Moorish theme. And the Marlborough Blenheim became a major attraction in the city. Absolutely a beautiful building. The one in the foreground, the kind of plainer looking one, the Queen Anne looking one, is the Marlborough. The Blenheim is the one with the nice domes. And you can see the dentist next to that. Okay, there we go. So that's the Marlborough Blenheim. Beautiful building. I want to talk about the piers, the amusement piers. The first pier opened in 1882. Captain John Young founded a lot of piers like Ocean Pier and the $1 Million Pier. Steel Pier opened in 1898. It was called the Showplace of the Nation Theater. A lot of stars performed there. Also, it was the home of the Diving Horse. So that's a picture of the Diving Horse. Now, what was the Diving Horse? For some reason, they thought it was a good idea to take horses, have young ladies ride the horses, and to have the horses jump into the ocean. I don't know why they thought this was a good thing for the horse or for the woman, but people like to see it. And today they don't have it because it is known as animal cruelty, but that is the Diving Horse in action. The $1 Million Pier, there's a picture of it. You can see they have clamming and fishing nets out there, and it's really packed. You can see some of the buildings in the background. Marlborough, Blenheim, basically Shelburne, going from left to right, Shelburne, Dennis, Marlborough, Blenheim, and then the Traymore lurking in the distance. Here's another picture of the $1 Million Pier. As you can see, they had amusements. There's some merry-go-round. They had an amusement hall. Lively stuff. Here's another picture of the $1 Million Pier where you would come in. So this is a major structure. Okay. In the 20s, conventions were a huge draw. Also, Atlantic City, interestingly enough, was the first off-Broadway really proving ground for places. So if you wanted to take your show to Broadway, you first took it to Atlantic City. After the Volstead Act was passed, Prohibition, national prohibition started January 17th, 1920, and they closed the saloons, but speakeasies and bootlegging really became a hit under the control of Nucky Johnson, who, if you watched the show Boardwalk Empire, was known as Nucky Thompson for some reason. And he did his business and threw his parties in the brand new Ritz-Carlton Hotel, which was later converted to apartments. And the city's hosting about 400 conventions a year on average, and a lot of people are drinking. There's a picture of Nucky, and there he is when he got married later in life. And what I like about this picture is how much everybody adores him in that picture. Even the police officer is really happy for him. I like that. Miss America started in 1921 as part of the Atlantic City Fall Pageant, and it was known as the Intercity Beauty Contest, not the Inner City Beauty Contest, the Intercity Beauty Contest. Margaret Gorman of Washington was the first winner. She was named, and originally she was just known as the Queen of the Inner City Beauty Contest, and the following year she became known as Miss America. The pageant ended in 1928, but they brought it back in 35. And originally, cities sponsored contestants. And by the 1960s, it was all states sponsoring contestants. It was first televised in 1959. You might remember Burt Parks was the host for decades of the show. It left Atlantic City in 2005, came back in 2013, and then left again. There's a picture of Ms. Gorman as the first Miss America, all the way back then. Convention Hall. So they first said we would like to have a place to have big conventions in 1905. They finally started building it 19 years later. The main hall of Convention Hall was bigger than football field inside. The roof was 137 feet high with no support pillars. It was the biggest unobstructed room in the world. And it opened in 1929. The West Hall was later added in 1971. And it's hosted championship boxing, WrestleMania, and a lot of other events, you know, including Miss America. Okay, there's a picture of what the hall, the main hall, looks like today. As you can see, it's got a lot of seating in there, and it looks like it's configured for hockey right now. Okay, here's a picture of it from the outside. You can see the main building in the center. That's John F. Kennedy Plaza in front. And you can see the West Hall to the west of it. So there it is. Okay. and today it's known as Boardwalk Hall. So the pipe organ is world famous, and growing up in Atlantic City, I never really appreciated this, but in December 1932, they debuted the biggest pipe organ in the world at Convention Hall, built by the Midmer-Loesch Company of New York. It had over 33,000 pipes. It cost $350,000 at the height of the Depression. So a lot of people said, ugh, this thing, it's a white elephant, which might be why they didn't promote it very much. They just figured people would forget about it. They used it. They used it for concerts. They used it for roller skating, ice skating. They eventually, as they renovated the building in the 80s, they destroyed it. Literally workers just hacked up the pipes, cut the cables. So they didn't really care about their history. Recently, though, since 2003, they've been renovating it. And it's great. If you go on YouTube and just Google Atlantic City Pipe Organ, you can see some of the recent concerts they've had. And it, brings a tear to my eye to see the organ being restored back to its former glory. So it's really great. Here's some pictures of the console. And if you ever do go to Atlantic City, they do have tours and demonstrations of the organ open to the public. So I would encourage you to go to that. It really is awe-inspiring to hear it played. So speaking of the Great Depression, somewhere in 1930, they still have conventions coming, but things are getting bad. In December of 1930, the Claridge opens. It's the last of the classic hotels. City businesses also get together to create unemployment insurance, a form of that. But a lot of banks fail. The city uses the money from the Civil Works Administration to rebuild the boardwalk. And in 1936, one of the interesting things that I find, again, that isn't very well known, but it is part of our history, is Charles White, who was the mayor of the city, said we should redevelop the city, and part of the redevelopment is a casino. And that didn't really go anywhere, but he said we can be the Monte Carlo of America. Should have listened. During World War II, first thing that happened is they turned off all the neon signs, and they did things like all the houses that have their curtain poles. They painted over the street lights. They muted headlights because they wanted to dim out the lights. Now, why did they? It wasn't because they thought the Germans were going to target Atlantic City and bomb the city. It was because the lights of the city would have silhouetted our ships, and they didn't want the U-boats to target our ships. So that's why they did it. So for several years, it was dim outs. 1942, they started Camp Boardwalk. Convention Hall was converted into a training center for the armed forces, and the hotels were converted into convalescent hospitals. And my uncle, Lou, who was a double amputee in World War II, actually met my Aunt Debbie there. She was his nurse, and they got married, and he was really one of the most remarkable people I've ever met. My Uncle Lou, he was an amputee. He was never bitter. One thing he told me is he described to me, he was patrolling a bridge. The bridge got bombed, and that's how he was injured. And he just said, it's amazing to me. He just said, thank God I never had to kill anybody. He was that kind of guy. He was also a pilot. So as a double amputee, he was a pilot. And I think he might have set a couple of records of flying across the country as a double amputee. So just one of the many people who came through Atlantic City. There's a big storm in 1944, but that kept us going strong. And after the war ended, they started to demobilize. And by June of 46, all the hotels were returned back to their civilian owners. All right, next, we're going to talk about the rebirth. And this is the moment they're celebrating the dawn of casino gaming, and don't they look excited? So a lot of other resorts around the Western Hemisphere, like Miami, the Caribbean, Las Vegas, started to become popular. In the 1950s, they weren't building a lot. They attempted to bring back the pre-Broadway theater. That failed. A lot of the big hotels were converted to apartments. By the 1960s, you had the competition, the infrastructure is crumbling, and there wasn't investment. Population shrinks, it gets poorer. And during the winter off season, more than 40% of the people in the city were unemployed. And I was born into this environment, so this kind of decline. 1964, they held the Democratic National Convention there, and that was a huge embarrassment for the city. Locally, they said, hey, we're going to get back on TV and people will come back. There wasn't a lot going on at the conventions. The reporters basically reported about how bad Atlantic City was and what a dump it was. You know, they said the hotels are filthy, the service is bad, the workers are rude. It's kind of rock bottom. I'll share another thing. So growing up again, going to high school in the 80s, I learned from my teachers that Democrats are bad tippers, because apparently during the convention, the delegates did not tip. So in Atlantic City, for at least 40 years afterwards, Democrats had reputations as being bad tippers. It's kind of funny. Like, that's what they remembered. They literally had the president inaugurated. They didn't remember that. They remembered people didn't tip, probably because of the bad service. So after this, they needed to reinvent. So there had been a lot of illegal gambling going on back from the 1880s, but it declines in the 1950s. But people locally remembered, hey, people used to gamble here. So in 1958, Mildred Fox started a campaign to legalize gambling. Ideas started to get a lot more momentum in the 70s. Las Vegas was doing great, so why not? So in 1974, they proposed legalizing gambling. They said, well, Atlantic City will be the main place with the casinos, but if a community wants casinos, they can vote for it, a local option. Voters didn't like that thought in New Jersey, and people spread baseless fears that organized crime would somehow show up in New Jersey. I mean, we can't imagine organized crime having any presence in the Garden State, and that they would get involved in the casino business. That couldn't happen, right? And it was voted down. 2 years later, and again, this is why I love Atlantic City. They're just optimists. Goes down to defeat. 2 years later, they have a new referendum. This one says only in Atlantic City. Also said senior citizens will get some of the tax revenues. Why is that smart? Well, senior citizens vote. People weren't afraid of casinos in every neighborhood. Senior citizens supported it, and it passed on November 2nd, 1976. Jimmy Carter was elected president, and Atlantic City got casino gambling. Okay, the rules were casinos had to have 500 hotel rooms. They'd have nightly entertainment. The casinos closed every night/morning. They had to have $2 and $5 blackjack tables. And there were a lot of complicated rules about how big the casino floor could be and how many slot machines there could be, how big the aisles were. They mandated the staffing levels. And if they didn't like your blueprints, they would say, go back and do them again. One famous example is that Caesars Boardwalk Regency submitted their blueprints. The tile in the bathroom was red. One of the casino control commissioners said she thought red tile was tacky, so they had to redo them. And you basically had to follow the rules. So the first casino opened Memorial Day weekend, 1978. It's May 26th. Was Osborne International owned Bahamas casinos. It started out as the Mary Carter Paint Company. Even before 1976 and the referendum passed, they bought Chalfont Haddon Hall, which was one of the big surviving hotels, for $2.5 million. The Division of Gaming Enforcement wanted to investigate everybody. The governor said, look, I campaigned in casinos. We need to get this casino open. So they gave them a temporary license. Here's some pictures of what it looked like as Chalfont Haddon Hall. And then a couple years after it opened, they decided to paint it white for some reason. I don't know why, but they did. So opening day, people waited in line for 2 hours just to get in the building. Then you had to wait in line for a slot machine. The streets were jammed. It made over $62 million in its first year. MGM Grand in Las Vegas had been the top casino in Vegas when it made, in its first month, MGM Grand in Vegas made $84 million in a year. So this was huge. And there's a picture of people waiting to get in at resorts. And you can see the boardwalk in the distance. Some other casinos, Caesars Boardwalk Regency opened up in June of 79. It was more profitable than Caesars Palace and Caesars Tahoe combined. Bally's originally wanted to renovate and keep the Marlborough Blenheim, but they demolished it to build Bally's Park Place. Opened in December of 79. They added the most beautiful tower that's ever been built in Atlantic City in 1989. So that was the Marlborough Blenheim right next to the Dennis. Here's what they did to it. That. And I was being very sarcastic when I said the tower was the most beautiful tower that's ever been added. And you can see to the left, that's still the Dennis Hotel there. So they incorporated the Dennis and then built the big tower. Ooh, I could go for the deli there. They have a nice deli. And you can see the Claridge Hotel in the background. So that's pretty much what they did. So a lot of other casinos opened, including the Sands, the Golden Nugget, the Playboy, the Claridge, which converted an original hotel, and the Tropicana. And until from 1982 to 1999, Atlantic City casinos made more money than Las Vegas casinos from gambling. It's interesting, but they didn't invest in a lot of other stuff like Las Vegas would in the 90s. Here's a picture of Atlantic City in 1984. As you can see there, you can see the Resorts International, you can see the Sands in the distance, and the Atlantis, which Playboy became. And you also see a lot of vacant lots. And to this day, there are a lot of vacant lots in Atlantic City. And it's amazing to me because this is basically, you know, a few dozen feet from the ocean, from the beach, and it's vacant lots. So at the industry's height in 2006, there were 12 casinos, annual revenues of over $5 billion, 40,000 people employed. And the problem was they made money too easily. They just had a bunch of quarter slot machines. There was no need to reinvest because it was so profitable. As other states, including Pennsylvania, legalized casinos, though, there were problems. The gaming revenue fell in half over the next decade. Okay, so the recession and the competition led to 3 casinos closing. That should be 2014. Another one closed in 2016, but reopened as the Hard Rock Atlantic City 2 years later. And in the past 3 or 4 years, sports betting and online betting have brought gaming revenue up, but actual casino revenue is still far below its peak. But there is some hope. You know, Atlantic City has reinvented itself a lot of times. First, it was a health resort, then a convention destination, then a speakeasy place where you would go drinking during the Prohibition, then a hospital, then a gaming hub. So it can do something again. I have faith. So here I have some pictures just to close up. I promised 45 minutes, and we're right around 45 minutes. So this is the city as it was around 1925-ish. So there it is, around 1925. That's the skyline. Here's the city as it looked in 1978 when resorts opened. And here's the city as it looks today. You can see they discovered the magic of Photoshop. This is a couple years old. This is probably about 5 years old, but this is pretty much what the city looks like today. You can see Borgata is a big casino in the back in the Marina District. So thank you. And that's my book. I will now stop sharing. Or I can leave this up if you like, but I'd love to take some questions. I thrive in questions either in the chat or in the voice.
Thank you, David. Does anyone have any questions or comments or stories they'd like to share with anyone? I want to point out, in case you didn't catch it in signals, the Marlborough and the Traymore were 2 very popular hotels for Swickleyans. In the pictures we have, if you look closely, you can see where they kind of line up with that original boardwalk area. And it's very cool. We have amazing pictures from 1898 that show the boardwalk developing behind it. And then we have more pictures from 1920. So you get to see that span. So that's another thing. I encourage you all, if you've ever gone to Atlantic City, you can have pictures to share them with me so we can build our collections. Yeah. He did. He had 2, I believe, at one point. One of them they just tore down last year.
I have a question.
Sure.
You never mentioned the elephant. Tell us about the elephant.
Oh, Lucy the Elephant. Okay, so Lucy the Elephant was an attraction that was built. It was known as the Elephant Hotel, and it's pretty small. It's about maybe 4 or 5 rooms in there, but you could actually walk up the leg of the elephant into the hotel. and it was somewhat popular, fell into disuse. It got moved from Atlantic City down to Margate, New Jersey, and then in the 70s and 80s was rehabilitated. And you can go there now. It's a very amusing attraction. Yeah, Lucy the elephant, right on the beach there.
I was actually there this summer because we took my niece Lucy to see Lucy the elephant.
Oh, nice.
And they are actually going to reskin her. That sounds so bad. For only the second time, they're going to replace all of the tin that she's covered in. But it is a very cool attraction. You go up the leg. It's a staircase about the size of the chair, but the inside is amazing. So if you're ever in New Jersey, and it's a National Historic Landmark, so you're supporting a landmark when you go. Obviously, I bought my niece Lucy the book, Lucy the Elephant Watcher. All the best of both worlds. Someone has a picture to share with us, David. He's going to hold it up. The camera's right
Oh,
there.
great.
Well, let me tell you the story first. My in-laws lived near Atlantic City in Northfield, New Jersey. So over the years, I made probably close to 50 trips down to Atlantic City. I liked the gambling. I was there when they opened in '78. Resorts International. But my first trip was probably the most memorable, but not in a pleasant way. Back in 1963, I was playing football for Indiana State College, later to become Indiana University of Pennsylvania. And our coach had scheduled a 10th game for us to play Montclair State, a New Jersey team, in the convention center the third weekend in November. Now, you were right, the inside of it would hold a football field, but interestingly, the end zones had to be propped about 2 yards on each end for it to fit in there. On the way down to New Jersey on a Friday, it was Friday, November 22nd, around 12:30, we heard the news that John F. Kennedy had been shot. A few minutes later, we found out that he died from that. So that was a horrible weekend. We walked that boardwalk Friday night, not knowing, we were all young guys, 20, 21, not knowing if we were going to play or not. And the Montclair players were down there also. We walked that boardwalk. I'll never forget it. It was stormy and gray and cold, third week in November. And then we still didn't know until the next morning. We were supposed to play Saturday night, and they told us that the game would be canceled and we would never not play the game. And of course, we never did play. So we headed home back on Sunday, back to Indiana State College. And then we were off for the weekend as most schools had closed. But it was a horrendous weekend when I think back to that. It was just such a unbelievably nostalgic and painful. That was one of we always thought afterwards, we talk about it. I'm still very much in touch with my colleague, one who's still living, my football teammates. And we always felt that was an awakening out of our youth. We became adults that weekend. And this is a picture of the stadium. We were staying at the Ritz-Carlton Hotel, which you mentioned. And you can't see it real well. It's a picture of the inside of the Atlantic City Convention Center and the football field. And then the other side shows.
Yeah, I could see that.
That we stayed in. And that was my first experience with Atlantic City.
Nice.
Any other questions or comments? All right, well, thank you so much, David. That was an excellent presentation.
Thank you all. Thank you all. It's so thrilling to me that people care about the history of Atlantic City. It means a great deal to me. You know, it's where my family's from. It's where I was born. So it's wonderful to share this with you. I'm really glad.
Thank you again, Dr. Schwartz. Please, everyone, I wish you were here to enjoy the refreshments. We're blessed to have Ian and Katie Sept, fresh baked goods from their bakery and square in historic harmony here this evening, along with Saltwater Taffy. Please take some time. It's nice to see everybody in person again. We hope to see you next month for our Friday session.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye, everyone.